Welcome to another Yorkton story. Twice a month, we look at Yorkton's past and present. Today, we go back more than 100 years in the first of two podcasts about the Balmoral Hotel, our 90 years a Yorkton landmark with a fascinating history. My name is Dick DeRike. I was a co-founder, co-owner, and editor of Yorkton This Week, and I've owned and operated other businesses in Yorkton over the past almost 50 years. This podcast is largely a labor of love, but we are grateful for the support of Harvest Meats and Gray Millers Canada, both here in Yorkton, and others who help out or listen to our stories. Our podcasts are heard on our website, yorktonstories.ca, where you will also find photos, links, and other information associated with each podcast when available. In many cases, you can not only hear the stories, you can also see and read information about the podcast topics. We can also be found in all major podcast directories, including Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Go to your favorite podcast directory, search for Yorkton Stories, and you'll find us. From 1928 to the early 2000s, the Seagram Corporation was one of the giants in Canadian industry. Its primary business was making and selling alcoholic beverages. It owned such distinguished product lines as Crown Royal, Chivas Regal Scotch, Captain Morgan Rum, and many, many more, including the distribution rights to Absolut vodka. But that wasn't the whole story, or the full extent of Seagram's business assets. At various times, it owned more than a quarter of DuPont Chemicals. It was a major shareholder in Conoco Oil. It owned Tropicana fruit juices. It had a major share in the media and entertainment giant Time Warner. It owned MCA, which it renamed Universal, a producer of movies and operator of theme parks. It had 45% of the cable television company USA Networks, and owned Polygram, a music record as well as film and television producer. Not bad for a company that had its roots in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, specifically in the Balmoral Hotel on Livingstone Street, where the Cornerstone Credit Union parking lot is now located. Not bad for a young man who bought the hotel in 1905. Actually, it was bought by his father, Ekiel Bronfman, for his two sons, Abe and Harry. Abe was 22 years old. Harry was 19. Much of what we know about the early years of the Bronfman family and their time in Yorkton can be found in three books: Booze, When Whiskey Ruled the West, by Calgary historian and author James Gray, published in 1972, Bronfman Dynasty, The Rothschilds of the New World, by Peter Newman, published in 1978, and The Whiskey Man, a small book based on research done by and folklore collected by former Yorkton archivist and historian Thérèse Lefebvre-Prince, better known locally as Terry Prince, about the Balmoral Hotel and Harry Bronfman. The City of Yorkton Archives also has information and photos, much of which can be seen on historic markers in the area where the Balmoral stood and the Bronfmans did business. All these sources don't necessarily agree on this piece of Yorkton history, now more than 100 years ago. This podcast uses the dates and information that are most feasible and are most widely recognized. However, mention of Yorkton, the Bronfmans, their hotels in Emerson and Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Port Arthur, Ontario, is conspicuously absent in the official history of Seagram. It seems that for a worldwide corporation, run throughout much of its history by younger brother Sam with an iron fist, the early years of the family history were best not talked about. That might have had something to do with the family's connection in the early years to the liquor business in which they were involved back then. It may have had something to do with the fact that Sam who was the younger brother, perhaps didn't want to give his brother and others their dues, as he largely sidelined his siblings in favor of his own sons. Likewise, in the Canadian Encyclopedia, you will find no mention of the Yorkton era in the family's history, and the only mention of Harry is his birth and death dates. The Bronfman family had come to Canada in 1889 from Bessarabia, a region in what is now southern Ukraine and Moldova, and had settled on a homestead near Wapella, Saskatchewan. Ekiel has been described in various writings as a gristmill operator and as a tobacco farmer, but he was not made for homesteading and prairie farming, apparently. After 2 years, the family moved to Brandon, where they stayed for 15 years, while Ekiel operated a business breaking, tending, and then selling wild horses and peddling wood slabs that had been trimmed from logs at the local sawmill, which he sold as fuel. He did well, and his 2 older sons, Abe and Harry, were sent off to Winnipeg to learn a trade, Abe as a cigar maker and Harry as a harness maker. That didn't last long, and when Abe and Harry left for Yorkton to run the Balmoral, the family, now with 2 more sons and 3 more daughters, moved to Winnipeg after 15 years in Brandon. The Balmoral Hotel, which burned to the ground in February of 1985, was a posh hotel when the Bronfmans bought it. It was on what was then called Front Street, alongside the main rail line, and it was the hotel of choice for travelers and salesmen who came in on the train. They renovated the hotel, and 2 years after taking over, advertised that the rooms now had steam heat, electric lights, electric bells, sample rooms for the salesmen to use, and hot and cold water baths, not in each room, mind you, but likely on each floor for guests to share. In 1912, Harry built a large addition that doubled the size of the hotel. Accounts of the early years of the Bronfmans and the Balmoral vary. James Gray, the author of Booze, wrote that business at the Balmoral was so good that Abe left Yorkton to buy and operate a hotel in Port Arthur, Ontario, now part of Thunder Bay. Other sources say there was a falling out between the 2 brothers because Abe preferred to spend his time playing poker, so Harry had his father move him out of Yorkton. Whichever is true, by 1908, Harry was the sole operator of the Balmoral Hotel, and high up on the front of the hotel was painted in very large letters, H. Bronfman, Proprietor. What does all of this have to do with Seagrams and the liquor empire the Bronfmans built through the mid and late 1900s? Nothing so far. But wait. According to Gray, Harry was easygoing, patient, and slow to anger, unlike his younger brother Sam, who occasionally would come to Yorkton to help run the hotel, and who had a hair-trigger temper, a blistering vocabulary of gutter oaths, and physically violent reactions, which made him the terror of the family. Gray quotes a Yorkton acquaintance as remembering Harry as a nice guy, really, always pleasant, a real Rotarian type, but my God, was he sharp with a mind like a steel trap. In 1916, City Council passed a motion to reduce Harry Bronfman's water account at the Balmoral for the year by 40% in consideration of the lavatories and wash houses in the premises known as the Balmoral being kept open for the use of the public. The Balmoral was the social center for Yorkton, where the elite of Yorkton of the day would have Sunday evening dinner because, as it was said, Harry always set a good table. The Balmoral Hotel bar in those years had a long, fully mirrored wall, good lighting, fancy tin ceiling, and a brass foot railing. Bars were strictly stand-up, no tables and chairs, so the men, women were not allowed in bars, leaned on the bar counter and maybe put the foot on the brass railing. If he chewed tobacco, he would try to stand within spitting distance of a spittoon. But owning the hotel was only part of Harry's business activity in the town. In 1911, he bought out his main competitor, the Royal Hotel, built in 1892, directly across from the train station where York City Plaza is now located downtown. And he tore it down in 1918 to build a newer hotel, which never materialized. He bought hotels in Saltcoats, Sheeho, Leslie, and Wynyard, towns along the CPR mainline. He bought the entire block on which the Balmoral stood, including the stores on the east side of the street and the buildings along Broadway, the present site of the Credit Union building. He also bought the buildings on the west side of 3rd Avenue South and the south side of Broadway between 3rd and 2nd Avenues, the site of more businesses. He owned it all, including the Princess Theatre on 3rd Avenue South, said to be the first theatre in Western Canada to sell popcorn. And he owned 200 city housing lots, likely a speculative investment that paid off as the town grew. He built or bought the city garage on Broadway, across the lane from the hotel, and became the dealer for Great Dort cars. He sold 810 cars in the first 2 years, in part by offering time payment plans, unheard of at the time. He also became a dealer for Nash and Cadillac, according to a footnote in Peter Newman's book, Bronfman Dynasty. Things were going well for Harry, other than being soundly defeated by businessman Levi Beck when he ran for mayor in 1910. It apparently left a bad taste in his mouth and seems to have been something he did not forget. War broke out in 1914, causing an economic recession that cut into his hotel business. And on July 1st of 1915, prohibition came into effect in Saskatchewan, a government ban on the sale of liquor, and 406 bars in the province did not open that day and stayed closed for 9 years. But while the sale of liquor within the province was prohibited, there were loopholes. And if there were loopholes, Harry wasn't shy about exploiting them. Prohibition laws closed legal drinking establishments and forbade the sale of alcohol as a beverage. Possession and consumption of alcohol, except in a private dwelling, was also forbidden. But alcohol could be purchased for industrial, scientific, mechanical, artistic, sacramental, and medicinal uses. And distillers, brewers, and licensed producers could sell their product outside of their home province. That opened the door for mail order businesses to sell and ship booze to customers in other provinces. Abe shut down his hotel in Port Arthur and moved to Kenora, Ontario, to supply the Winnipeg market with liquor by mail. He then moved to Montreal to supply the Eastern Ontario market. When the federal government closed that loophole in 1917 and put the mail order houses out of business, Harry applied for and received a license for a wholesale drug company in Yorkton called the Canada Pure Drug Company. The pure drug, of course, was alcohol. He constructed a building next to the Balmoral Hotel to house that company. That building later became the home of the early years of the Parkland Community College and SIGN, the Society for the Involvement of Good Neighbors. Peter Newman, in Bronf Dynasty, writes that while family legend credits Sam Bronfman with all the genius and much of the impetus for the creation of the Seagram Empire, it was his elder brother Harry who actually provided most of the early imagination and momentum that allowed the fragile enterprise to mature and prosper. James Gray writes in his book, Booze, that the operation in Yorkton became the vehicle on which Harry rocketed the Bronfman clan to fortune. He named the chapter about Harry and his years at the Balmoral, Yorkton, where Harry planted the money tree. There is no one left alive, of course, from that era. But in 1993, Mick Burrs, as part of a city project to interview longtime Yorkton residents about their recollections of the early days, talked to Jewel Jones. Mick was the poet in residence at the Yorkton Public Library. Jewel was the daughter of Gus and Irene Gibson and tells about an experience her father had transporting alcohol for Harry Bronfman. This short clip is part of that oral history collection of the city of Yorkton, used with permission. Jewel was married to Charles Jones, and she died in 2004.
He went to Detroit, and he became a mechanic, and he learned how to drive a car. And he came out here, and during the years, he did drive Dr. Patrick, which was a doctor that was here for many years. And he drove him a lot of places.
Was he like his personal chauffeur, so to speak?
Yeah, until he... Well, the richer people in Yorkton had cars, but they didn't know how to drive them until somebody showed them how.
Right.
But, when Bronfmans were here and owned the hotels here.
Balmoral.
Mm-hmm. My dad, he used to run whiskey or rum, I don't know, rum runners for Bronfman. You had to make money somehow, as long as you didn't get caught.
Yeah.
But he wasn't the only one doing it. I mean, there was other ways of doing it, but Daddy could drive a car. So
he had that valuable asset.
Yeah, to be a good crook, I guess. My dad had high values, especially for women. Women were on a pedestal to my dad. He respected women above everything.
I respected his daughters very much, and his wife.
And his wife. One time, there's one time I'll tell you about. He had been to Winnipeg and picked up this load of rum or whatever it was. And the police had got tipped off that Daddy was coming back with this whiskey.
Did he put it in it? Where did he put it in the car?
I don't know.
Covered it up with something?
Sure. So he knew the police had got wind of it. We used to have great big haystacks, not these rolled up bales now.
Right.
We had great big haystacks out in the fields. And so Daddy knew that this one cop, I know his name, but I'm not going to tell you.
You don't have to say names.
Because they're Yorkton people too.
That's right, you don't have to say names, it's all right.
And so Daddy thought, what the heck will I do? He's laying for, and they were the best of friends. This cop and he was a plainclothesman.
Each is doing their role here.
Yeah. So Daddy spots this haystack. And so he gunned that car. I don't know how, maybe they'd go 25 miles an hour, I don't know. And he gunned it, and as it went in, the hay all went up and around the car and hit it. He left it there.
The whole car?
The whole car was just outside of Yorkton. And he had a room in the Balmoral Hotel then. And he hightailed it back to the
he walked or ran?
Yeah, ran. He got there. And he just nicely got undressed and into bed, knocked on the door. Here was this cop, figuring that Daddy wouldn't be there. Well, as it turned out, he just nicely got into bed. And so that was one time and after that, that was it. He was no more whiskey running. I don't know how much he'd done before or after, but then that was too close for comfort.
Then in 1996, a young reporter for CBC Radio, Corrine Larson, born and raised in Yorkton, interviewed several people who were directly involved in those years or who knew some of that history. She talked to Gary Fletcher, then the owner of Fletcher's Drug on the north side of Broadway, just around the corner from 3rd Avenue. She talked to Mildred Baldwin, a retired teacher who was familiar with the temperance movement that pressured governments to institute prohibition, and with Lawrence Ford, her grandfather, whose father knew Harry Bronfman. The recording of that radio documentary was captured and preserved by the City of Yorkton Archives, and we play it recognizing CBC Radio as the source. The story is introduced by Lindy Thorson, host of the noon edition, when it aired on April the 17th, 1996.
Back in the days of Prohibition, the taps were shut on beer and liquor sales. But liquor, hey, it still flowed quite easily underground. Corrine Larson takes a look back at the city of Yorkton, beginning just before the ban on the Demon Rum.
They crowd around the bar like pigs at a trough, lapping up the whiskey that the bartender sells. There are no chairs here, just a brass bar caked with mud and straw. They rest a tired foot on the bar for balance and spit the thick black juice of tobacco from their mouths. The bar, a place to drink and a place to get drunk. And it's not much different outside. Drunks propped against the shovel, ready for work the next day. Fights in the alley, petty thievery. Even drunks aren't safe on the streets at night. Then, on December 11th, 1916, the music stopped. The people of Saskatchewan had had enough. They voted 4-1 to close every bar and liquor store in the province. The law said that Saskatchewan would be alcohol-free for the next 8 years. But when it comes to quenching a dry prairie thirst, some laws are made to be broken.
This is the Army, Mr. Joe.
It's the middle of the First World War, and as Canadian soldiers fire guns across the sea, the temperance movement is arming themselves for a different kind of fight at home.
But you won't have it there anymore.
Alcohol induces disease and insanity, suicide and murder. In short, it is a cancer of the body.
The corkscrew will never pull any man out of trouble.
Alcohol is the spirit born of hell.
A bar to joy that home imparts, a door to tears and aching hearts, a door to heaven, a door to hell. Whoever named it well. I hereby promise, God helping me, to abstain from all distilled, fermented, and malt liquor, including beer, wine, and cider, as a beverage, and to employ all proper means to discourage the use of and traffic in the same.
Mildred Baldwin was 8 years old when the Demon Rum was outlawed in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. As a young girl, she was eager to compete in a public speaking contest run by the Women's Christian Temperance Union.
But I can only remember one line. "What ails Papa, Mama?" I said one day. And that's as far as I can go. But of course, Papa was drunk.
And although Mildred lived in a house free from booze, she saw firsthand the effects of alcohol in Yorkton.
There were quite a few people that I knew that would drink a little more than what was good for them. And one of their daughters had to go and help bring the dad home so often, you know. We saw it firsthand, the troubles that could result from it.
On the surface, the liquor tap was sealed shut, but the Demon Rum flowed quite freely underground, and it was the railroad that brought it to the prairies. As the CPR gathered steam across Canada, communities sprang up behind it. Towns that missed the line missed out on the business. Yorkton was missing out on the boom, so in 1890, the whole town just picked up and moved 2.5 miles south to meet the railway. When the government closed the last bar door 27 years later, the railroad opened up the doors of opportunity to many bar and hotel owners. The CPR's run from Winnipeg to Edmonton was often delayed by 30 minutes as barrels of booze were unloaded to thirsty customers.
There's a drawer at the bottom of this stairs, and this drawer contained a diary of Dick Pappy's.
The back rooms and basement of Gary Fletcher's drugstore hide the many mysteries of Prohibition. Over 80 years ago, when Dick Patrick used to run this store, drugstores were popular places to be.
Drugstores became the only legal source of alcohol during the Prohibition. So then the drugstore, you might say, became your liquor store.
Druggists did most of the brewing themselves. Homemade kegs of whiskey and other throat lubricants were not an uncommon sight in the back rooms of drugstores. At the start of Prohibition in 1917, Saskatchewan druggists filled over 29,000 prescriptions, all of them for 12 and 26-ounce bottles.
They're sitting and talking to the doctor to impress on the doctor that they really needed this alcoholic beverage as medicinal use. And I'm sure the doctors had got to the point where they had heard it all many, many times and probably had the prescription written before they finished their second cough.
The shelves were well stocked with liver and kidney cures, Lydia Pinkham's compound, and Ayer's sarsaparilla. Most of these cures were 40% pure alcohol mixed with molasses, sulfuric acid, and a spit of fresh tobacco to give that liquor that well-aged look.
See, this was the entrance to the speakeasy.
Fletcher has found even more clues. Speakeasies were mini bars set up in the back of drugstores where people would sneak in for a few drinks when no one was looking.
You can almost imagine, can't you? It's still got the old atmosphere of what it would be like in those days. We've got a small open area, a bar, people sitting around in wire-backed chairs, and here you've got actually a little elevated area up here with a stairway. There's a washroom up there, and I can see this little room as being quite an active spot during the Prohibition era.
The Princess Theatre was right there. Right, you see where that bottle is? And there was a place in the back here where they run their cars. In the back of the Princess Theatre, that's where they loaded the booze up.
Fletcher is not the only one who believes the stories. Lawrence Ford was there when it all happened. He used to go with his father to the most famous hotel in Yorkton, the Balmoral. The hotel was owned by Harry Bronfman. The Bronfmans later made a fortune in liquor with Seagram's distillery, but they got their start right here in Yorkton.
They went down, they had to go down in the basement. They rolled out a barrel of beer out of this tunnel to get a bottle of beer apiece to have a drink. And the beer was then in wooden barrels, all covered with a cover over them. And of course, I wondered why they didn't give me one.
And while his father spoke with Harry Bronfman, Ford wandered through a tunnel that took him to the Princess Theatre.
This tunnel, you know what a tunnel was like to a kid. They caught up with me, and I was just going up the stairs. If they'd left me longer, I'd have found the tunnel maybe the other way, too.
This tunnel is said to have connected the railway to the Balmoral Hotel and other outlets in the city. Harry Bronfman conveniently set up his Canada Pure Drug Company right across the street from the railway. From there, he was able to easily distribute the medicine to the people who wanted it.
It still looks pretty good, doesn't it? Now, it's, of course, just a plywood door now because it's all been filled in with steel and concrete. But up until last year, that would take you right out to the middle of Broadway.
Fletcher examines what used to be an underground entrance to his drugstore. This could be the tunnel that connected the store to the shipments that arrived at the Balmoral.
When they manufactured over by the old Balmoral Hotel, there were a number of hotels that, of course, were selling liquor illegally, and they wouldn't be able to transport this product around in the open view of people. So, obviously, there had to be, you might say, an underhanded method of getting the supplies around to the hotels.
Seemed like everyone took advantages of loopholes in the law. It was illegal to transport liquor within provincial borders, but not illegal to move it from Saskatchewan to Manitoba. And across the U.S. border, Not a problem. Even before Prohibition in the States, bootleggers were making their money running rum south of the border.
There were enlarged tanks built right into the cars so that huge quantities of the liquor could be run across the border. And who knows what else they would have done. Maybe they even filled up the tires.
Drug companies established a kind of here it is, now come and get it system of sales. Export stores dotted the landscape of southern Saskatchewan. And legend has it that Al Capone and other famous gangsters used to pick up their booze in these towns, and it may all be linked to the filled door in Gary Fletcher's basement.
Now, who knows? It might have connected with this Tuttle system, which would have been just in the street in front of us. But there's no doubt the width is right and the direction is correct. So who knows? This might have been part of the network in those days.
It doesn't matter if there's any proof of what went on in those days. The memories, the stories, and the legend still lives on in Fletcher's drugstore. In Yorkton, I'm Corrine Larson.
It was a very profitable enterprise that Harry established in Yorkton. Producing so-called drugs for druggists was one thing. But with the United States about to implement Prohibition in January of 1920, and the Canadian government deciding that booze could be produced, but only for export, a whole new prospect for profit opened up. The booze that was produced, and any that was imported, had to be stored in a bonded warehouse. Having good connections to the Liberal government in Ottawa, Harry had no trouble obtaining a bonded warehouse license. With both a provincial wholesale drug license and owning a bonded warehouse next to the Balmoral, Harry could import alcohol from abroad without any limit of quantity, as long as it was imported only for the purpose of export out of province. But Harry and his brother Sam, who had now joined him in this Yorkton venture, decided there was more that could be done. They could import liquor from overseas and blend it in their own facilities, bottle it, and sell it as booze, not as a drug. As Peter Newman recalls in his book, Harry Bronfman, wholesale druggist of Yorkton, had secured a supply line from Scottish distillers and made major purchases of American liquor offered at bargain sell-off prices in the pre-Prohibition sell-off south of the border. During a 4-month period in 1921, according to government records of the day, the Canada Pure Drug Company imported 300,000 gallons of alcohol from the United States. They were ready. By the spring of 1920, they were in the blending business. The Bronfmans had bought 10 1,000-gallon galvanized iron vats lined with oak, a machine that could fill 1,000 bottles an hour, a labeling machine that put 2 labels on the bottle and 1 over the cork, and negotiated deals with distillers in Ontario and Kentucky for carloads of ethyl alcohol. Into the vats would go 382 gallons of water, 318 gallons of 65 overproof raw alcohol, 100 gallons of aged rye whiskey, a dash of caramel, and a shot of sulfuric acid. Caramel was added in various quantities to give the whiskey the right color. If a batch was to be sold as quality Scotch, some real Scotch was added to give it a touch of the peat smoke taste. Rum was made by adding more caramel and molasses. Aging is an important part of the blending process, so Harry decided that his blends would be given a full 2 days to mellow. It was then bottled and labels slapped on. Labels with fake names, like Johnny Walker with a Y in Johnny, to resemble Johnny Walker, the real stuff, which spelled Johnny with an I-E, and Glenn Levitt, Glenlevitt, a look-alike for Glenlivet, a great name in Scotch. If whiskey was being bottled, regardless of the name on the bottle, it all came out of the same vat. But the fake Johnnie Walker commanded a much higher price than the no-name bottle. In testimony in a court case in which the Bronfmans were involved at the time, documents showed that the blended whiskey cost them $5.25 a gallon, and once bottled, sold for the equivalent of $25 a gallon. The Yorkton plant was processing an average of 5,000 gallons a week. Annual profit, $4.6 million. And those were 1921 dollars. About $77 million today. Harry was running the Yorkton operation, while Sam went on the road, mainly to make contact with American bootleggers. Ottawa had declared liquor export to the United States legal, but the Bronfmans had decided not to do the shipping themselves. Their message was, here it is, come and get it. And the Americans did. First to Yorkton, then to a series of warehouses the Bronfmans set up just north of the North Dakota and Montana borders. In Estevan, Beanfate, Glenewan, Carnduff, Kerryvale, and Gainsborough, from which they sold their booze. For American bootleggers, or rum runners as they were called, the favored mode of transportation was the Studebaker car, dubbed the Whiskey Six. It was stripped down, upholstery was removed, springs were reinforced, so it could carry 40 cases of whiskey. Harry had opened his city garage so that bootleggers could get their cars serviced while waiting for their next load, according to Newman. He reputedly also kept a stock of used cars filled with booze in front of the Balmoral and sold them as is to anyone who might want to engage in a little moonlighting. To protect his American customers, Harry set up Trans-Canada Transportation Limited, licensed as a common carrier, a trucking company. He would give the proper documents to the drivers heading back south, so if they were ever stopped on the Canadian side of the border, they could prove that they were working for a properly accredited transportation company. As Newman writes, it was only when the cars got back onto American turf that their journey turned illegal. They eluded American federal agents by disappearing into clouds of dust stirred up by 30-foot chains dragged behind their speeding booze-mobiles over gravel or dirt roads, the only kind of roads there were at that time. At night, miniature searchlights mounted on rear windows would direct fierce beams into the eyes of police car drivers following them. And to further encourage American bootleggers to buy from him, Harry set up an insurance scheme. If their liquor was seized in Canada, he would replace it. If their car was seized, he would put up the bond to have it released. In 1921, Harry, by then a millionaire many times over, moved to Regina, where he had bought a large house on what is now College Avenue. He hired Frank Bruner to run the Balmoral, and he set up a mixing and bottling operation in Regina. In June of 1922, the Saskatchewan government passed a law to restrict liquor export houses to cities of 10,000 or more, ensuring they could only be located in Regina, Moose Jaw, and Saskatoon. The border area warehouses were closed, and Harry changed by shipping booze by railway express to stations near the border, where American bootleggers could still pick up their goods. Harry told the Winnipeg Tribune in an interview in 1922 that with the exception of two small concerns in Saskatoon, which had practically run out of stock, the liquor business is controlled by him. By the end of that year, the federal government put an end to all export trade in liquor, and Harry sold off his Regina operation. He had already soured on the booze business by then. His brother-in-law, Paul Madoff, who was in charge of the Bean Fate warehouse, was shot and killed as he sat in his office, a crime that was never solved, but generally attributed to organized crime which was making its way into the liquor trade. The murder was a shock to the Bronfman family, and Harry moved to Winnipeg and then to Montreal. Sam became the head of the family liquor business and expanded it greatly. At the end of 1965, the company was active in 119 countries and sales exceeded $1 billion. By 1977, that grew to sales of $2.2 billion and profits of $84 million. Harry was largely relegated to the background. He died in Montreal in 1963 at the age of 77. Seagram's, meanwhile, had merged some of its operations with other companies and sold off some pieces. By 2003, it largely disappeared. But by then, the Bronfman family had sold out its interests. Stan Obodiak, whose multifaceted life we covered in a previous podcast, recalled to Peter Newman that before Sam and Harry died, he tried to get them to build the Bronfman Slavic Theater for Arts and Culture in Yorkton. That didn't happen. Stan surmised it was because of Harry's ill feeling towards his defeat in his run for mayor many, many years before, which Harry attributed to the fact he was Jewish and from Eastern Europe in a town that was largely Anglo-Saxon and Christian at the time. Harry left $5,000 in his will to the Yorkton synagogue for a desperately needed new furnace. Sam left nothing. But Harry had indeed planted the money tree in Yorkton, starting with the Balmoral Hotel. And he had lived up to the family name, Bronfman, a Yiddish word that translates to brandy man or whiskey man. Postscript. What about those tunnels under the streets of Yorkton that Gary Fletcher alluded to in the CBC radio story? Did they exist? Do they still? In a future podcast, we continue our look at the Balmoral Hotel through the eyes of an almost lifelong resident of Yorkton, whose parents bought the Balmoral and operated it for 30 years, and who lived and grew up in the hotel. Maybe he can shed some light on it. Or maybe not. We will publish another podcast in a few weeks. Visit yorktonstories.ca to hear all podcasts, and there you can also sign up to our email list so that we can let you know when a new episode is available. Thanks again to our sponsors, Harvest Meats and Grain Millers, and thank you for listening. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome. Get in touch through our website or by emailing Dick, D-I-C-K, at yorktonstories.ca. Let's talk again soon and explore another Yorkton story.